And without further ado, I bring to you Tina. Tina is here as a poet, is here as a person sharing her story, of her family's story. There are 3 frames in the back that have some information from Tina, as well as we have a video which is off now because Tina's here in person, where I was fortunate enough to hear her story and my son was able to record it. So there are multiple ways that you can access and hear from Tina.
I haven't seen it yet.
So welcome and
thanks. Thank you for coming. So can everybody hear me okay? So my voice is a little off. Perfect. So forgive me for that. So unlike Ariel's family, my family didn't speak very much at all about the Armenian genocide. They just wanted to move on. And they were a family that celebrated life. And actually it amazes me that just a few years after escaping from genocide, they were able to dance, have parties, cook, have friends, family. But I remember my mother, when I was very young, telling me about how much she loved her father. They had a marble entryway in their home. I think they were quite wealthy in Smyrna, which is now called Izmir. The Turkish government changed the name after the genocide. So I remember that, and she said he would come home from work, and I don't know what kind of work he did, and he would lift her up in his arms, and how I remember the warmth and love she felt for her father. So I'm going to read a poem. It's like a story poem that I wrote a very, very long time ago, and I revised it slightly recently. It's a little bit brutal, but what was done to the Armenians in the Armenian genocide was unbelievably more brutal than anything in this poem. And let's see, what else? All right, well, I'll read the poem first. And then I wanted to read a quote from Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish-Jewish lawyer who actually coined the word genocide, like there was no word for genocide when the Armenian genocide happened. But I'll read it now. This is from the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The origin of the term genocide and its codification in international law have their roots in the mass murder of Armenians in 1915 to 1916. Lawyer Raphael Lemkin, the coiner of the word, and later its champion at the United Nations, repeatedly stated that early exposure to newspaper stories about Ottoman crimes against Armenians was key to his beliefs about the need for legal protection of groups, a core element in the UN Genocide Convention of 1948. And then there's a quote from Raphael Lemkin. I created this book, and of course I had 2 months to do it, and I started 2 days ago, so it's not quite totally complete, but this is in that book. And his story is really, really interesting and ends kind of sadly. Apparently he died penniless, but he's an interesting person to look up. And his quote from him is, "I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and after the Armenians, Hitler took action." So I'll read my story poem, and then I wanted to read a quote from Hitler. Facts about my grandmother. My Armenian grandmother was born in 1870 in Ottoman Turkey, in a town called Afyon Karahisar, which means Black Fortress Opium. The poppies grew wild there. In 1915, the Turks took my grandfather, hanged him probably with the other Armenian men and boys. In 1915, my grandmother dressed her young son in girls' clothing so he would not be taken and killed. In 1915, the Turks sliced off the heads of my grandmother's sister, Anush, and her husband in the courtyard of their home. Their little girl, Eliza, watched. My grandmother and her 3 children, my mother, my aunt, and my uncle, were driven from their home by Turkish soldiers into the Syrian desert with the other Armenian women, children, and old men. My grandmother and her children walked 1,000 miles. The desert was covered with corpses. She saw women raped, Armenian girls forced to dance, stripped naked, then set on fire. She saw Turkish soldiers cut off the breasts of nursing mothers, impale their infants on daggers. She saw Armenian girls hold hands and drown themselves in the rivers to save themselves. The rivers ran red with blood. In 1955, 40 years later, my grandmother sits on her 4-poster bed in her apartment in Washington Heights, New York City, in America, whose ground she kissed. I braid her long, silky gray hair. In my grandmother's kitchen, my mother and my aunt cook pilaf and shish kebab and bake sweet baklava in the shape of diamonds. Uncle Eddie, my Aunt Annie's husband, carves the roast beef. In the living room, Uncle Miran, my grandmother's son, reads the news from blossoming Armenia. On the upright radio, the Armenian Hour broadcasts from Providence, Rhode Island. Music plays, the romantic Yerevan nights. Yerevan's the capital of Armenia. My grandmother invites us to the dining table. We are here, we are together, we are alive. So that's my poem. And so Hitler was very inspired by the Armenian genocide. He took great confidence in the fact that people forgot about it eventually. At the time, there were loads and loads of newspaper articles in the New York Times and all the papers. There was a lot of news about it, the starving Armenians, the orphans. But eventually it was forgotten. And even though in Turkey, initially, way back then, there was a trial in absentia of the perpetrators of the genocide. But then after that, with the Republic of Turkey being established and they just wanted to, forget about it, Turkey denies the Armenian genocide to this day and actively tries to rewrite history. Okay, so this is a quote from Hitler. It's also an inscription from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I have issued the command, and I'll have anybody who utters but one word of criticism executed by a firing squad, that our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus shall we gain the living space, Lebensraum, which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? That was August 22nd, 1939. I don't know, anything else? Well, my mother, I wasn't going to go into my whole family story, but I will a little bit, since Ariel did. But my mother, so they walked 1,000 miles. I don't know how my grandmother survived. I really don't know. But I was told by a family friend from the same city that a Turkish family helped them along the way. And probably because my family was wealthy, my grandmother probably she was very smart. She probably hid jewels on her person and bribed Turkish soldiers, But they walked from Smyrna to Beirut, which is 1,000 miles. And then she apparently got a job, like working as a maid in somebody's house. And then because the war was over, this is World War I, I guess the Allies said it was safe to return to their homes. So they went back to Smyrna, and an Armenian-American man had joined the French Foreign Legion to fight against the Turks and met my mother somehow. And she was like 15 or 16, probably 15. And they married her like an arranged marriage. My family married her to him so she could come to America. So she came to America in 1921 with him. And and then 1922, she, I guess, convinced him, and we had some cousins in Providence, Rhode Island, to bring her mother, her sister, and her brother over to America also. That was 1922. So they came over in 1922, just before the Turks set fire to the city of Smyrna. The city of Smyrna was like the most cosmopolitan city in all of the Ottoman Empire. Muslims, Turks, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Americans all lived together. It was a beautiful, beautiful city. And in order to destroy its Greek, Assyrian, and Armenian Christian populations, the Turks set fire to the city and destroyed it. And lots of people died. You know, they were. It's on the Aegean. They were jumping into the Aegean to try to save themselves. Some of the Allied ships in the harbor took some on board, but most perished. So anyway, my family, my grandmother, my aunt, my uncle came over just before that happened. So very, very lucky. And so my mother's first husband, the one that she was arrangedly married to, she had 3 sons, one after the other. She was like 16 years old. And stayed married to him for about 20 years or so. He turned out to be abusive. And 1940-ish, she was begging her family to let her leave him. And they kept saying, we'll try again, you know. And eventually she did divorce him in 1941 or 42, when women were not getting divorced, you know. And in fact, in the Armenian community, and then she met my father, and they were seeing each other. And in the Armenian community, there was all this, you know, gossip about, oh my God, she's divorced, and you know, she's not married, and she's with him. And he was a very good-looking, sought-after bachelor about town. And until my father's friend was the Armenian archbishop, and he went out with them one day, and then they just stopped gossiping, you know. So, you know, then she divorced him, met my father, very luckily, and they stayed married. You know, she died in 1968. She was only 63. My father lived to 1981. He died, he was age 96. My father came to this country in 1907 with his family's fur business. So the fur business, which was in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, right? Had branches in Leipzig, Germany, in Paris, in Ethiopia, in Bulgaria, and so they wanted to open a branch in New York, so my father came with that business to New York and maintained that business for himself for over 60 years. His family, except for one of his brothers, did not really experience a genocide because they had left before the worst part of it started. Even before the genocide of 1915 to 1923, there were massacres of Armenians throughout Turkey. So hundreds of thousands of people were killed before that. And in fact, there's a new book by 2 Jewish scholars, you know, seeing these massacres as part of the entire campaign of eliminating the Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, which were the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Assyrians, not Syrians, Assyrian, who also experienced genocide during that period. So my father's, this is kind of interesting, my father's brothers they had an Oriental rug business in Constantinople, and they were approached by the Emperor of Ethiopia, which was the one before Haile Selassie, and he asked them to come to Ethiopia, to Addis Ababa, and establish an Oriental rug weaving industry, which they did. So that my father's brothers moved to Ethiopia. And then I have relatives, like because of the genocide, like the Jews, I suppose, there are Armenians all over the world, just about in every single country. So I have relatives myself in Argentina, Bulgaria, Greece, Paris, America, of course, and Ethiopia. So I have a little interesting story. It's not really related to the genocide, but I just can't get over it. I was at a theater in Manhattan by myself to see this performance of Egyptian belly dancing. And so I'm sitting in a row, and then people in front of me start to speak, taking their seats, and they're speaking in Armenian. So I said to them, "Oh, you're Armenian. I'm Armenian too." And they had accents when they were speaking English. They had accents. So I said, "Where are you from?" So they said Ethiopia, of all places. And I said, "Oh, really? Like my father's brothers, lived in Ethiopia." And it turned out they were they lived right next to my father's family. He was the godfather of my father's brother's daughter. It was just amazing. And we've been in touch like ever since.
Wow.
I don't know what else to say. Oh, except that I have a little something in this book, but it might not be totally clear. But right now, Armenia, we're really worried about the nation of Armenia because Azerbaijan and with their ally Turkey, like they consider themselves like one nation, are threatening the sovereignty of the country, really. They've attacked border towns, and the president or prime minister of Armenia is giving all these concessions to them, and there's just so much lies and hate being spewed forth by Azerbaijan against the Armenians, and to the extent of appropriating the Armenian culture. Like Armenia, it's a very, very ancient culture, like thousands of years before Christ. It was the first Christian nation in 301 AD. Armenia adopted Christianity as its official religion before Rome. Rome, I think, was 303 AD. So it's a very tiny country now. It was an ancient, very large kingdom that encompassed like most of Turkey, modern Turkey today. So Armenia is bordered by Georgia, the nation of Georgia to the north, Iran to the south, Turkey to the west, and Azerbaijan to the east. So Armenia borders, Turkey and Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan last year, in 2023, it's not ancient history, cut off the corridor between Armenia itself and this area that for millennia has been occupied by ethnic Armenians have been living in this area, but it's within Azerbaijan's borders. And they cut off the supply route of water, food, all goods, to this area of ethnic Armenians from Armenia, because they controlled that corridor. So 120,000 ethnic Armenians from that area, abandoned their homes and left into Armenia, where, had their families had been living for millennia. So that just happened last year. I wanted to sing a song now that I've talked about our enemy, Azerbaijan. But I want to sing a song that was actually written by. It's an Azerbaijani 1913 comic operetta, but it was translated immediately into Armenian and many other languages. And it was right after it was performed in. It wasn't performed in Azerbaijan. It was performed in Paris, I think, or somewhere else now. I can't remember where. some sophisticated place. It was then performed in Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, in Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, in another city, which is the capital of Turkmenistan. So it's been translated. There was also a film made of it, and it's been translated into like 80 different languages. So it's called Arshi Malalan. But this is, should I say what the song means first, or should I say it first?
Real.
So it's a very lighthearted song. It's a comic operetta, and this fellow, and this was written in 1913, so this fellow wants to find, the love of his life. He's single. He's a bachelor, and but at that time, you could not meet, young women in families. You had to be introduced. And so his friend, Suleiman, advises him to become a peddler, and in that way he can go around to different houses and meet all these young girls. And he does that, and he meets, the love of his life. He falls in love immediately, and he cannot live without her. And in the operetta, eventually they get married. So this is the song, but it's in Armenian.
Oh.
So I hope I can sing it. So bear with me. Suleimani khorurtov Arshimalji es tartsa Kishetarek pododelov Verchabes yes kes kada Vochoki chei deser Darderos chei batmer Serein che chidei Kezi desa siretsi I'm vesiretsi Hakvav siretsi Sardan siretsi Yes kez Vorchem garo arans kez I'm vesiretsi Hakvav siretsi Sardan siretsi Yes kez Vorchem abrir arans kez.
Thank you.